Hello, welcome back to our series of tutorials on the Tidyverse. We're ready now for the second tutorial on grouping and summarizing. My name is Wouter van Attenveld of the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. As I said earlier, you can go to vanattenveld.com/r, which is nothing more than a more readable link to our GitHub sites. And this GitHub site actually has all the handouts and all the links to the videos that I'm making right now, and also links to the R for Data Science book, which is a fantastic open source book on the various aspects of the Tidyverse. And today we'll be looking at the handout called Summarizing Data. So if you want to follow along, all the code that I'll be using can be found here in the handout on data summarization. All right, so what do we mean with data summarization? First, let's actually go back to where we were earlier. So we activate the Tidyverse, make sure you actually install it, and we read the guns polls that we saw earlier. So this is a data set from 538, which has a number of polls on things related to guns in the United States. Each of the rows is one poll. So for example, this is a poll taken from CNN about whether guns, the legal age for having a firearm should be raised to 21. And you can see that among registered voters, there was overall support for it, and Democrats are more in favor than Republicans. Because I really don't like column names with spaces in them, I'm going to immediately rename those two columns, call them Rep and Dem. So we now have a data set containing the question, Republican support, Democratic support, etc. Now, in the previous tutorial, you've seen how you can manipulate this data on a row-by-row basis, select certain rows, mutate certain rows, arrange by the rows. Today, we're actually going to see how you can calculate values for multiple rows. For example, one of the first things we could do is say that we want to know which of those various questions on average had how much support, averaging over all different polls. To do this, in the Tidyverse, you actually use two commands always. The first is group by, and group by basically says what are you grouping by, what are your groups going to be. So that's group by question, and then we summarize and we say the support equals the mean of the support. And if we run this, you'll see that we now have a data set with only one row for each of the groups, so one row per poll, with the average support for that poll. Now this syntax is always more or less the same. So I take my data, I group it by the question in this case. That doesn't actually change the data yet, it just sort of registers my group, that we have 8 groups. And then I summarize it, and in the summary you always say which columns you want to create, and then there should be a summarization function, in this case the mean, of an existing column. We could also do multiple columns, so we could also say support SD equals the standard deviation of the support, and right, sorry, this is actually me, so we should have called this support mean. I'll explain in a second why that is. So this is now the mean of the support, and this is the standard deviation around that mean. And you'll see that one of them doesn't actually have a standard deviation, and probably most of you will immediately understand why a value will have a mean but no standard deviation. But if we want to be certain, we can actually get the count as well, which is a function called n. So that's just the number of cases, and you see that indeed there's only one case, and of course with one case there's no definition for a standard deviation. Now let's backtrack a little bit to the error I made earlier. I call this support as mean support, and then support SD is SD support, right? This is what I did, and then if you run this, everything is missing value. And the reason why that is because if you compute multiple values, you can actually use the earlier computations in the next one. So this variable no longer refers to the original support column, it now refers to the mean of the support column, the column containing the mean support, and of course that is going to be the same within the group. So again, there's no standard deviation there. Right, so we've seen now how you can group, and we've seen that once you've grouped you can summarize, and the result of a group by summarize is a new data set that always has exactly the amount of rows that you had groups. In this case there's 8 groups, 8 different questions, and there's one column for each of your grouping variables, and there's one column for each of your newly computed values, and of course all the other values are dropped. Next to having a single grouping variable, you can also have multiple grouping variables. For example, you could say I want to group by question and by population, and then compute again the mean support. If we run this, then you'll see the average support for adults on this question and the average support for registered voters on this question. So now you have one column for question, one column for population, and one row for each question population combination. What is interesting to note is that after this, it retained the question as the grouping variable. Basically, if you had two grouping variables, if you summarize, it drops this one and it keeps this one. It always peels one off from the ends. And it gives a little message telling you that that's actually what it did, and that we can override it with the groups argument if we really want to. What this means is that we can now actually continue going. So for example, we could now immediately do a new summarize and say, for example, that we want again to take the mean of the support. Now what does this do? This will actually take the mean of these two values. And so basically we now don't have the mean of the individual polls, we have the mean of the individual means. So this is a mean of means. Now that might not sound extremely useful, but it will be very useful if we consider the next option, namely rather than doing group by summarize, we do group by mutate. So what we've now been doing is group by summarize. Now let's do group by mutate. If we do group by mutate, what you'll see is that actually, and let's call this variable the mean, it will have kept all my 57 rows, so it won't have dropped everything. It will have computed a new value called mean here that is the same, and this is the mean of all the polls in this group. So this is an identical value for all the age 21, this is identical for all the armed teachers, etc. And so where group by summarize drops everything you have and returns you a new data frame with one row per group and one column only for your computed values, the group by mutate keeps all your original rows and just adds a new column, giving some sort of average or other aggregation summarization of the values. Of course, it will repeat this value then for every row in the group. You can immediately use this also, for example, to calculate which of those polls underestimates or overestimates the support. So we could compute the difference as the mean minus the support. And then you see here that actually, let's do it the other way around, support minus the mean. And then you can see here that this poll had a lower estimate of the support than the average, and this row had a higher support than average. And so this is a very useful way of combining a summarization function with a normal calculation to calculate the relationship between the rows and the averages for that specific group. So you could use this, for example, to calculate which of your respondents are higher than average for their group, are quicker than average, or whatever is useful for your respondents. If we now go back to our original case with a double grouping variable, so we computed the mean support by question by population. So now you have the age 21 and adults, and this is the support for the adults, this is the support for the registered voters. Now it's still grouped by question, so we can immediately now run a mutate, and we could say the group mean equals the mean of the support. And then you can see here that the on the age 21, on the average of the two values is 75.4, and of course now we could also say the difference equals the support minus the mean support. And then you can see that this one is slightly here, and here the adults are lower than the average, so lower than the registered voters, and here the adults are on average higher than the registered voters. So what I wanted to show you here is that you can use group by summarize to group by one or multiple variables, and for each of those groups compute one or multiple summary statistics. And you can also use group by mutate to compute the same summary statistic per group, but instead of only keeping the summary statistics, you add the summary statistic for all the rows in a specific group to the original data set. And you could also combine them by giving multiple commands. A final thing that I'd like to show is the so-called ungroup. So after we did this, remember it was still grouped by question. Now suppose we don't want to have the mean per question here, we want the overall mean here. Then what we could do is now ungroup this, and after ungrouping it is no longer grouped. So now if we calculate the mean, it'll give us the overall mean support. So we could of course now also calculate the difference, ST support minus the mean support, so you can now see which questions in which populations on average have more support than the mean or less support than the mean. Alright, hopefully this gave you a good overview of the various ways of grouping by and computing summary values. And of course, all these commands are in the handout with some explanations, so feel free to have a look at this handout, practice with it, and especially also to play around with it. And remember, you can't break anything, you can't do anything wrong, just have fun and see how far you can get with doing data summarization in R.